this year was rather hectic or even dramatic with regards to regulations. We had MiFID II kicking in. We had the new ESMA restrictions that we're going to discuss later. And two a little less related issues like GDPR and even the social media ban on the advertisement for the industry. All those things basically led to three main trends. One would be some European brokers seeking to sell their licenses and putting them on the table. The second one would be brokers looking to diversify and to go to other jurisdictions. And three would be, like John mentioned, basically brokers trying to cope with the situation and trying to stay in the EU or more specifically in the CISEX jurisdiction, doing whatever it takes. So we're going to start with the panel here, and we're going to start with the first general question. And please introduce yourselves and try to answer shortly because we have a lot of topics to go through. So I want to know from all the list that I just mentioned, and there are more obviously, all those occurrences and all those actions by the regulators, what do you view as the most dramatic and most significant one and why? So Tzvi, let's start with you.
Okay, so hello everyone. I think this is on now. So my name is Tzvi Gabay. I am a lawyer based in Israel, dealing mostly with financial regulation and enforcement in connection with financial regulation. So it's before you get into trouble and after you get into trouble. And hopefully you don't get into trouble. But also just for the context, I'm an ex-regulator. I was the head of enforcement at the Israel Securities Authority. So that gives me a little more perspective. But actually, it's funny that you talk about ESMA and you talk about MiFID II that kicks in. And I think that the most significant thing that happened in the past year, I think, is the ICOs and the way regulators are dealing with ICOs. Now, you know what, actually, that's a little too narrow. I think it's the blockchain meteorite that's about to hit us, and the fallouts are already hitting us. And the reason I think this is very significant is because we're challenging financial regulation, and technology is challenging financial regulation as we know it, right? If MiFID is all about disclosure of conflict of interest and is about minimum capital so that there's a nice cushion there if a firm collapses, then when you're talking about decentralized brokerage systems, then that's all regulation it's way in the past and it's irrelevant. So I think the biggest challenge, and we can see a huge diversity between regulators in the way they approach and address this challenge, is really how to deal with where technology is taking us, because it's going to have a crucial and dramatic impact on financial regulation.
Thank you. Natalia?
Hi. My name is Natalia Hunik. I'm a global head of sales at Advanced Markets. Advanced Markets is an institutional liquidity provider. We hold the AFSL license in Australia, operate globally, and we deal with a lot of institutional clients, which include brokers, funds, regional bank from all around the world. And what we're discussing here is the biggest impact. And of course, we talk to clients from all around the world, and the biggest impact, the most impact that we'll see probably from the upcoming, a lot of upcoming regulatory changes is MiFID II and ESMA. And I think the biggest one is probably reduction of leverage. And I can't select one, so it's going to be a reduction of leverage and negative balance protection.
Thank you. John?
Hi, I'm John Crancis. I'm CEO of Australian Securities and Frankfurt Stock Exchange listed. I sign this. I'm also an attorney. I still hold a little bit of a practice certificate. I don't tend to practice in the law that much at the moment. Typically, what we see, the larger issues that our clients are facing, we, as a payment institution, or actually an e-money institution that offers transactional banking between Australia and the European Union, some of the things that we see are the way that our customers that hold AFSLs and CISEC licenses, the different way that they treat customer data, the different way they approach data. We unfortunately have some actions in the Federal Court of Australia at the moment where our customers who are SIFs that have come down to Australia have adopted practices from here and they haven't gone down particularly well in Australia, and ASIC is all over them. So what will happen is that the GDPR and Australia will finally be in line. So the privacy requirements that we have in Australia will effectively take place tomorrow here in Europe. So that means that the practices of yesterday in terms of how you would solicit your customers, implied consent, non-express consent, I should say, using data for non-purposive things like assuming you can use your customer data for things, are all gone. You need to be careful the way you solicit and you approach your customers. So as a payment provider or an e-banking institution, we are very careful about the data that we also collect and hold on your behalf and your customers' behalf, and make sure that this information is only used for the purpose that it was intended.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ron Finberg from Capitec Regulation. I'm one of the people heading our financial technology solution to help for MiFID, EMIR, and Australian derivative reporting. I think that probably the biggest item taking place around the world, and not just necessarily in this industry, is the changing view of banks and payment processors to high-risk institutions. You know, people are having their banks closed. You have to, you know, different credit card processors are, you know, they're changing what you can do. And what's taking place is that instead of like the old way where you'd have you just go to one of the 3 or 4 payment processors, you get everything set up, you have your merchant bank set up in 3 months, now it takes up to a year. You suddenly, you know, having all those different funnels of where the cash is going. And what's happening is because of that, suddenly you're seeing people putting money into cryptocurrencies. China is, you know, everybody's trying to take yuan to bitcoins and then sending it everywhere in the world. And that just kind of change of how money is being transferred around the world, just being stopped, and, you know, these stopgaps everywhere taking place, I think is the biggest issue, and that's one of the main drivers of ICOs and cryptocurrencies, and just changing how, you know, money's transferred around the world.
Hi, I'm Michael Charlamides. I'm from eCompay. Basically, eCompay now, we're a group. We have a company which is under the FCA in London. We're a principal member of Visa MasterCard. We also have an EMI license in Central Bank of Cyprus, members of SWIFT and SEPA. And we also recently placed in the group TFI Markets, which is a currency conversion exchange. We regulate both under CySEC and as a payment institution at the central bank. I sat next to you hoping to be first, but I'm last. Either way.
That's personal.
I'll make a note of that. So either way, I would like, and I'm hoping to make this with the rest of the panel as exciting as possible, because we're going to be talking about regulation as well. And a lot of the things that have been hitting the wall recently, like anything that they said from GDPR up to PSD2, MiFID 2, and basically what we all know as suffocation by regulation. Well, it is indeed suffocation by regulation. We've been seeing this, I mean, just by the IFX Expo and the visits coming here every year. We've been experiencing different scenarios and different visitors coming. Most of the visitors in the first year that we came were mostly from regulated environments, and they were coming here seeking regulatory solutions on how to further expand their services across the globe. The second year, we started seeing a lot of unregulated companies popping up, coming and asking for solutions. Everybody was intrigued. I'm talking about mostly about payments, acquiring solution providers like us. Everybody was intrigued in trying to provide solutions for all of these unregulated markets and unregulated providers. Third year, you have the same scenario, but more providers like us being reluctant. And now we come to today, at least towards our experience, and we see more companies kind of turning back to regulation, to be honest. I don't know if you agree or disagree, but I would say I do see a lot more visitors coming. Maybe it's because we're specializing in the industry, and I'm just talking about our booth. But in our case, I'm seeing more companies coming back to regulation. What I'm trying to say by all of this timeline is that the faces or the professionals or the people that you see on a frequent basis are people which are actually, at the end of the day, embracing regulation. And they're trying to enter the markets in the correct way and going forwards. As John even said, the Australian regulators are actually catching up to speed, and they're not going to allow a lot of cowboy-style business happening anymore. This is actually a global trend. I mean, GDPR is a global trend. PSD2 might be a European one in MiFID II, but they are trying to adjust the whole market on a global level. So what I would mostly embrace in this conversation and say is that, yes, regulation is there. We have to understand that it's trying to maybe, in the case of PSD2, is trying to create competition, which I'll explain what competition means according to PSD2 or my understanding. And MiFID II is trying to actually cut out all non-regulated business. But at the end of the day, I would say regulation is what keeps longevity, professionalism, and staying viable if you manage to find the correct network and market. The market has been too fragmented, I believe, in our industry.
So following up on what Michael said, obviously we all understand that we need regulation, but some brokers claim that, as you said also, that this regulation suffocation is upon Europe right now. And some people claim that Europe is becoming more and more expensive, and even more specifically, CySec is becoming more challenging and more expensive. So I would like to ask Natalia, what do you say? Is Europe becoming more expensive? I mean, we recently reported so many CySec brokers offering their licenses for sale, so many brokers wanting to go into the GCC market as an alternative. What's your take on it?
Yes, certainly Europe becoming more expensive, CySec in particular, and you guys covered the
I
story.
would be more specific. Is it becoming too expensive?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I think there's generally maybe two directions that brokers are taking. There are some that are, are committed and they will be staying in Europe and they are making efforts in order to comply with the regulation. And of course, there are other ones who are engaging in what I call a regulatory hedge, where they go and they understand that a lot more restrictions are coming down the line, so they try to get established in perhaps offshore jurisdictions in order just to hedge the regulatory risk, and try to kind of go and see how the situation will unveil in Europe, and then perhaps switch some of the business in alternative jurisdiction. And so speaking about that, Australia, we have a gentleman from Australia, has become a very lucrative jurisdiction of choice for many of the brokers who are currently operating mainly in the European Union, because as I mentioned, the biggest challenge that I see for the brokers is the leverage reduction, right? I mean, it certainly will impact the trade and volume, which is going to hit the bottom line, essentially, of the brokerage houses. And because at the moment there's no leverage restriction in Australia, and I'm sure John can enlighten us when that's coming, because it's probably coming, the Australian license has become very much demanded by larger, brokers operating in the industry. And so, we see very high premiums asked for the AFSL licenses.
Tzvi, what's your take on it? I see that you're eager to...
I'll say two things. First of all, we're living in this day and age. The world is our playground. It's not countries. They almost don't matter. Definitely not when we're talking about e-payment solutions and electronic and internet-based services. Definitely when we're talking about blockchain. So what you're going to see is two things. First of all, you're always going to see a movement towards the place of least resistance. So where the regulation is the easiest, where the regulation is, or where there's no regulation, you're going to see players there. Now you talk about brokers moving out of CySec or wanting to sell. I think I'll say two things. Regulation it trends, and there's cycles, and we're living now in a time where it's on top, and if I'm going to try to attempt to be a prophet, it's going to go down. It's not going to disappear, but it's going to go down. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is, because we're at a peak, companies, and individuals that thought that they would buy a license, that, oh yeah, sure, we'll get the license because it's good for our reputation, but didn't understand what it means. And MiFID and GDPR goes into the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day. It's not, I have a license, wow, that's great. It's, you need to actually do stuff about it on a day-to-day basis. And for those companies to realize that it's too much for them and to leave, that's not a bad thing in my mind.
I have to disagree because I think you're putting a lot of focus on the resistance and like, oh, where is the easiest to have a regulation? And I think one thing that people don't necessarily pay attention to is the supply and demand of their clients. Because you have clients, I think when you talk about Cyprus has become more expensive, I think you also have to look at what do Forex retail traders care about, which regulation are they looking for? So I think in the eyes of a lot of people, especially from Asia, having a UK license is a lot more prestigious than having a Cyprus license. So when you take that into account as well, and not just whether CySIC is making it harder to do business here, then there's also this level of, the value is being over, a CySIC license is being overvalued compared to what it was 3 years ago. And not a lot of people are necessarily looking at that, and they're just looking at where's the easiest thing to set up. And the same thing's going to happen with any other regulation where if you do, if you have some random regulation for an ICO you want to go launch, people might be cool now, but in 6 months from now, people might be looking at that and saying, that's not relevant to us. I don't want to be involved with that. And that has to be on people's heads as far as like, how can I market my regulation? What does it do for me on a much larger level than just, how do I comply with my daily reporting or quarterly audits and things like that?
So we were talking about alternatives, but the question is whether are there alternatives outside of Europe, and let's leave Australia aside for a second, because some people would go to more exotic jurisdictions and then they start working, and then at the end of the day they need to go through the system once again. They need to pay salaries and they need to use the banking system. So my question is whether the alternative is really an alternative. I mean, can you really manage your business when you're not fully regulated in a known jurisdiction such as CySEC or even FCA? So John, what's your take on it, given your experience in payments?
Well, I'm actually going to go the other way. We're seeing a lot of CIFs come down to Australia for pretty much the reason you've cited. It's a reputable jurisdiction that is more localised than the UK. People know where Australia is. We have a lot of CIFs that are trading into the Asia Pacific market, and as a payments provider, we're providing support in their local currencies. Difficult currencies like Thai baht, the Viet Dong, the Malaysian rupee, and all those sort of things. And rather than going into these territories where they could only operate local to that territory, operating from Australia gives them the entire Asia Pacific sort of basin. The problem, the upside with Australia, of course, is we don't have the leverage restrictions. So you can go a little bit wild on that. In fact, you can go very wild on that. We also don't regulate ICOs particularly well. So the only regulation on ICOs...
I don't think anyone regulates that well.
No, but I'm saying we don't regulate it very well at all. So there's a hint there. But, what we need to do is, as a payment provider, is ensure that we put some rules around it ourselves. And, of course, MasterCard and Visa are bringing new rules this October that also will regulate what's called the 6211 category, which is everyone in this room, presumably brokers, CFD traders, FX. And it means that you all need to go through another hurdle again for us to process you. Right? If you don't know about that yet, talk to your payment processor. But, I will disagree. I think places like Australia, where you do have that regulatory overlay and that surety, it provides surety for the operator as well as the customer. Right? So going into these somewhat less or more dubious jurisdictions like the Philippines, Malaysia and so on, I think it's a trap. It's a trap for operators because some of them even have currency controls, and getting your money back out is going to be a challenge.
Michael, I see that you're eager to answer. Can you elaborate a little more about what problems brokers might face upon going to those jurisdictions?
Yeah, well, basically, we've covered a lot of topics here. I'm trying to make this as clear and constructive as possible. So in terms of whether regulation is actually going to go down again, I would like to see that. Definitely, I agree. I would love to see that, but I doubt if actually anybody's going to allow that to happen. The reason that regulation became stiff to begin with and more strict is because they're trying to cut out the fragmentation of the market. I mean, most of the companies that we're seeing here today, they began out of Europe. So initially it was just a few big companies. Later on it became more fragmented. More and more companies started getting licenses, whether that was from CISEC or FCA or anywhere else throughout Europe. It became very fragmented. And then a lot of the European countries started having disputes between them about how the traders were being treated by the operators. So this is what gave birth to MiFID and MiFID II, trying to protect the traders. Now, I would say that the next step of most of the companies, and this is what I see, I would agree with the trap idea, is that most of the companies now, they're trying to find new markets to penetrate. New markets which are still kind of young and doing baby steps in the regulation. And we're talking about more experienced companies which might be smaller on a European scale and they're trying to enter new markets. So they're going into jurisdictions like Mauritius now and getting licenses out of Mauritius. Okay, so what are they doing with Mauritius that they're going there? They're trying to basically build up minimum setup, skeleton crew over there, and they're just trying to enter the market, and the regulator still doesn't know how to identify this in order to allow them to enter Asia. And then what payment solutions do you get? You get payment solutions that are going out of Mauritius into the rest of Asia, which is totally unregulated, and then companies start getting hits by Reuters, and they're getting hits by WorldCheck, and they're getting different complaints by Japanese authorities or any other Asian authorities. So basically, some of the operators and the market, they're still trying to find new markets to enter, to create a spike in their sales, rather than create a strategy of how to long-term maintain a loyal target base of customers and traders. So what I would advise in overall as a general rule is rather than just trying all the time to find unharnessed and new markets to enter, which eventually will correct themselves either by regulation or deregulation or just by banning the instruments to begin with, it's better to find a strategy of maintaining a loyal base, of improving the services, of improving the platforms, of creating innovations. Because this is what this industry is all about. It belongs in the fintech sector. We should be looking at innovations and specializations rather than just trying to keep creating spikes and maintaining the initial trend that we created when we actually entered the market as companies. I'm not talking, when I say we, I'm not talking as a payment provider. I'm talking as a fintech industry as a whole and mostly about you guys as operators. There should be a strategy on how to actually develop the product even more, create a strategy, create a vision, and not just try to enter new markets where you might get hit. And at the same time, you're going to make your partners, which are payment providers, get hit as well.
Okay, so let's jump real quickly to cryptocurrencies because obviously we cannot ignore that. So Zvi was talking about cryptocurrency meteor hitting us. And in our industry, we see so many brokers offering different types of crypto assets in different ways. Ron, in your view, what are the challenges that brokers are facing currently from the regulatory perspective upon offering such assets?
I think the most prevalent question we have is just what is it in terms of what's it being classified as a trading instrument? So both do you have to are there daily reports that have to be done? Do your corporate governments apply the same way? So thankfully in the past several months the FCA and the AMF in France have both issued very direct, concise explanations that if you have a derivative based on them, that would be options or CFDs, they are a MiFID II product. What does it mean if you have a MiFID II product? You have to have the same type of corporate governance on those products when you offer to clients the same way if you do a gold CFD or a Eurodollar CFD. However, they did say that it's its own category. They haven't defined yet whether it's considered a currency or whether it's considered a commodity. And this is an important thing because then down the line when you have to figure out how do you do your auditing for it, your reports, you have to figure out how does that fit in. And currently you can't really do it because it doesn't fit within the guidelines. ESMA and the local regulators haven't given a definitive explanation of what asset class it is. So I think that's the biggest thing. And then I think for John and Michael to kind of get into just in terms of the regulatory aspects of just accepting it as a payment is another question, whether there's legals to that.
Okay.
I can.
Yeah.
Australia just regulated Bitcoin, so we're actually a little bit schizophrenic on it. The tax office treats it as a commodity, and the money laundering regulator treats it as a currency. So the actual exchanges are now all regulated. They need to be licensed and so on. That then has knock-on effects into how it's treated as a derivative, of course. So and the leverage again. It's the old Australian rules of, I think, maximum leverage applies. But certainly I think what we're going to see is more regulation around the crypto. We don't have a challenge in dealing with crypto as a payment provider, either as a derivative on a platform from a broker or directly as a quasi-currency. The card scheme rules are fairly clear on what we need to do, as I think our Australian regulation. And certainly where we sit, we've got some of the biggest exchanges on the world already on our platform trading in crypto. So we're reasonably comfortable with it, and providing that we take a reasonable view on these things, I think there's some upside in it.
Tzvi, this dispute between commodity and currency that's been going on, and you saw in the U.S. several regulators and the IRS, disputing between them how to define it, and leaving the brokers and the other players on this field very confused. What's your take on it? I know that in Israel it's also an issue.
Right. The world is confused because the regulators are confused. Hey, the SEC, for example, so there's Clayton, the chairman of the SEC, who's being very negative towards ICOs, and all ICOs are scams, and they're all security tokens, and it doesn't matter how you want to try to call it a commodity, call it a utility, call it whatever, it's a security, and that's how we'll treat it. But so what you see is and this touches upon exactly the things that we talked about. So suddenly the United States is not so much a jurisdiction for ICOs, so they move out. Or, and this again touches exactly upon what we're talking about, or we see more and more companies, and I see this, companies saying, we want to do an ICO and we want to do it in the United States, regulated by the SEC. So we're going to call it a security, we're not going to play any games, it's not a utility, and we're going to go we're going to do it fully pursuant to U.S. security laws. So I enjoy the prestige of doing it in the United States, and that's a good thing. But also within the SEC, there are other voices. There's another commissioner who actually, she published a paper and gave a speech a few weeks ago saying that she thinks that Clayton is being too aggressive. She thinks that the regulator is taking upon itself a role of pushing back progress and the future, which shouldn't be its role. So, I mean, we're talking about serious stuff here. In Europe, we also see different approaches. I think the Swiss approach is very interesting. I think what regulators tend to do is no one likes change, and regulators really hate change. So unless it's change that they initiate. So like MiFID II and other regulation. So suddenly this thing hits, and what the regulators are busy doing is taking new technology and trying to fit it in these old buckets that they're familiar with. Is it a security or is it not security? Let's treat it as security. Is it a financial product? Does it fit into MiFID or it doesn't fit into MiFID? And I think that what the Swiss regulators is doing is very interesting. Is not really looking at the past, but looking to the future and saying maybe we need a new model, taking its time and developing something, which is, I think that's where ultimately everyone will be going.
Okay, you mentioned ICOs, and we see so many brokers and other players, financial players entering the ICO markets in this way or the other, either joining ICOs or even initiating ICOs. Natalia, a general question, what do you think about this trend in general? And more specifically, what tips would you give to a broker wanting to enter an ICO venture? What does it need to do? What does it need to consider, in your view?
Sure, it's certainly a trend, and we've seen a lot of brokerages from the business, launching their own ICOs. I would say when you go into this, this is, of course, many people treat it as a once-in-a-lifetime type of an opportunity where you can, raise the money in the market and, perhaps, elevate your business to the next level. However, there's a lot of negativity surrounding the ICO, so, potentially it could impact your existing brand. So you need to look at those implications and weigh the pros and the cons of doing the ICO. We've seen some of the companies from the financial industry kind of played with the idea of ICO, but then eventually went and raised the money through the traditional venture capitalism from the VC firms. And again, I think those are the people who probably did the due diligence, and they looked at what are the pros of doing the ICO. So in general, I think if you really take your time and you look at jurisdictions and you look maybe doing it in the United States or any other prestigious jurisdiction, I would say maybe that's a viable opportunity. However, if you're just looking to raise quick cash and don't think about implications that could potentially impact your brand, and we kind of see that with the with the whole marketing ban, and a lot of people try to do the ICO, and 3 days later the Facebook account was turned off, and there's still a lot of negativity surrounding the ICO. I think for valid reasons, because of course everyone knows that only a fraction of those are real projects. A lot of projects are coming out without minimum viable product and without having any decent plan. So I mean, and that's why there's a lot of criticism, and of course the traditional media outlets are trying to take steps in order to prevent retail investors from taking on or investing into something that they don't really understand.
Thank you. So I think we'll move on to the summarizing question. And I want you guys to be as elaborate as possible and not to speak in general lines. In your view, and Tzvi, you mentioned it earlier when you talked about cycles, and you said that we're high up in terms of the regulators being very severe with the regulated entities, and we're about to see some more relaxed regulation in the future. So my question is, what does the future holds in terms of the regulations? And bear in mind that, and correct me if I'm wrong, legislating is a lot easier than canceling laws. So I want to understand the mechanism of it really going to be easier on the regulated entities, if any. So again, I'm going to repeat the question because it was too long. What the future holds in terms of the regulations for the next year? Where we're going to be when we're going to meet in a year, and we're going to discuss what happened in 2018.
Okay. I put myself in this hole, right? Because I said that regulation will go down.
Yeah.
Well, it will go down. First of all, I agree. I think that laws will not be abolished from the legal books, but a few things will happen. First of all, and I'm sure that definitely the other panelists here know and appreciate, that regulation is something, A, you get used to, and B, you develop mechanisms of coping with it. And they're digital. You use digital platforms, and you use e-platforms, and you use providers, and KYC used to be very, very difficult and used to be based on, and sometimes when you read those statutes, you can literally see the paradigm. Someone taking an ID, looking at the client and trying to derive whether or not this person is okay to onboard, and this doesn't happen anymore because the processes are different. It's algorithms that do the work. So in a way, the system gets used to it, and the costs and the burden ease up. But if you're asking me where I see the future going, I don't know if it's next year, but it's definitely in the next few years and not in the far future. I see a lot of the regulation, or at least some regulation, actually become part of the product. When we're talking about blockchain and we're talking about smart contracts, there's absolutely no reason in the world why we can't have a Bitcoin equivalent that does KYC in and of itself. And I think that this is something that we're seeing now more and more decentralized brokers. That deems a lot of the regulation and part of MiFID II irrelevant. So we're seeing things that will change the way we're used to dealing with financial regulation. And I see technology and blockchain having a major role in this because it directly affects all of the intermediaries, and that's what financial regulation is focused on.
Natalia, take the role of the prophet. Let us know.
I agree that regulations are cyclical, definitely, and I think that people will learn to adapt. I think also the big dilemma right now is okay. MiFID II came into play in January 3rd, right? However, I don't think most of the industry is really compliant. I think there's still a lot more work to be done, which will take a couple years to adjust all your systems in order to be compliant. And another thing is, how is it going to be enforced? This is also kind of a big question. I don't know how it's going to be enforced. I think it's it's a question to the regulators. The biggest change, again, is the leverage and the negative balance protection. And I see a lot of panic in people's eyes when they start talking about the new ESMA rules. And that's kind of the reactive thing is, go open somewhere, open some jurisdiction where, I can lay over the clients in case something bad happens. And, this really comes down really harsh on the brokers. I think the leverage will eventually play out. I mean, it's pretty dramatic, 30-1 on FX. However, it happened in other jurisdictions as well before. It happened in Japan in 2011, and I don't think it impacted the Japanese volume as much. It has changed the landscape of the market dramatically. They had hundreds of firms, and they're basically down to less than 50. So I think we kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier. The consolidation trend is certainly going to occur, as I think someone on the panel already said, maybe it was Michael, that look, there are some brokers who just got the license for the sake of getting the license, and because it's prestigious to have an FCA license, but we're not really prepared to all the scrutiny and all the regulation and reporting that comes with it. And so perhaps we'll see a lot of those people exiting the market and passing on the reins to the guys who are ready to take on that challenge.
John?
We took a different approach some years back. We saw the writing on the wall with all this regulation, and we built up, here's a plug, our own product called Paydentity. Paydentity basically manages the onboarding, KYC, payments, custodial accounts, e-money accounts, our payments to affiliates, as well as the GDPR. So as an ISO 27001 PCI compliant company that's regulated by the Prudential regulator, we already have to do all these things. So what we did was productize the regulation. We productized our compliance effectively, spun it out as a product, and we now offer that to a number of SIFs, and we offer that across 2 continents, so Australia and Europe. And I know looking around the room, I can see some of our customers in the room. It's something that takes the headache away from actually dealing with a lot of this stuff. Now, I'm not saying we do your job for you, but we have to do the job anyway. So why not use the information that we collect already? Why not use the secure services that we've already got and use that to basically meet a lot of your compliance? Now, we would expect more and more service providers to do this, productize it, as you said. We already work with blockchain.info. We are their KYC provider for the last 18 months. So I sign this. If you actually go into if anyone's technically oriented here, if you go into the code, the source, you can actually see that I sign this is the identity provider for the blockchain.info wallet, for the last 18 months. So we are very much in terms of looking forward. The regulations, I think, are here to stay. We're not going to try to convince regulators to minimise them. What we're going to do is minimise the impact on you. take away the pain from you, the operator.
We're
We've already
really
got to take the
short
pain.
on time, John, so I'll have to,
That's right.
to cut
And
you.
that's,
Sorry.
that's the way we go. Over to you.
Right.
Okay. I believe it's really important to understand that the conversation we're having here about regulation in the financial world is the same one happening around every other industry. So, you know, Uber and others are having the question about what to do about self-driving cars, and we're dealing with the government. You know, Google had their Google Assistant. They showed their presentation of making a phone call, how the robot made a phone call to order reservations for lunch. How do you deal with robots, you know, talking to each other? That's another thing that people have to starting to regulate. So that, you know, there's going to be over-regulate. This is, as technology advances, we're going to have this ongoing questions of how to deal with the more and more regulation. And one thing that I think what Zvi was saying is that the combination of technology and regulation, I believe this has to be the future. And honestly, I'm pretty surprised that it doesn't exist. Some pseudo, I mean, if someone wants to make an ICO about it, here's the idea, but you take you kind of like have a Wikipedia type of solution where you have people giving different input. How do you interpret the regulation? What's the issues going on it? So instead of having these consultant papers that take, you know, 6 months to get information and the regulators have to process it, you can do that on a blockchain or some sort of online methodology where okay, these are the ideas. This is what's being voted up. This is the input. You know, after 2 hours or something like that, it gets locked in, and that becomes the regulation or the interpretation of the regulation.
Tokenized regulations.
Yeah, and there's no reason why tokenization of regulations shouldn't occur. It should exist right now. We just call it, you know, private working groups of 10 people instead of, you know, 10,000. But that's kind of like the view I see. Across the world, this is how regulation is going to move.
Last but not least, MCGC.
Yeah, in the house. So, I love this question about what the future holds. Well, I would say that in my point of view, the future holds three things: cashless, blockchain, specialization. So what do we mean by cashless? Everything's becoming digital. So whether that's banking, whether that's acquiring, whether that's a personal e-wallet, whether that's wire transfers, whatever it is that has to do with fiat money is moving towards cashless. So where is cashless leading to then? To blockchain. So in the blockchain environment, we're seeing a lot of cryptos being born. We're seeing a lot of other type of technology being used. We've even seen the Ripple, and I mean, like 1 month ago when I was in another panel, they asked me, so is the Ripple the way forward for this solution towards cryptos and blockchain and trading? Well, you know, everything is still being developed. There's nobody can say securely that that's going to be the solution. Blockchain is a technology that, you know, has been used and has been utilized by the cryptocurrencies, especially by Bitcoin. It has been revealed to the world. It's there now. It's a fact. Everybody's dealing with it. I mean, even us, we're thinking about how we can utilize the blockchain in terms of creating the nodes between multiple servers to ensure that the data is always safe kept and that no manipulation can happen. And on the third part that I said, specialization, it comes back both to you guys and to us as payment providers. It's what I started off the conversation to begin with. So you guys should specialize in your product, in your jurisdiction. It's very important not just to consider, yes, the world is becoming a smaller place to trade. Yes, regulators are trying to work between them, but specialization is not just needed based on the product you're offering, whether that's a CFD, whether that's an ICO, whether that's an exchangery. You actually need to specialize in the jurisdiction you operate. Don't try to, you know, just penetrate into new markets and say that, oh, well, you know what, the wind is going to carry us through and we're going to make it. You should specialize in every part. And so on, and I'm finishing here, and so are the regulators too. They are trying to specialize as well, and that's what's happening. So that's what ESMA is trying to do with MiFID II. That's what the central bank regulators are trying to do with in its jurisdiction with PSD2. I mean, even PSD2 for our cases, each regulator throughout Europe is just, you know, giving us our time to adjust to it. So,
Michael, we're gonna have to...
once again, it's going to be specialization, blockchain, and cashless. So if you want to talk about this more, I'm in booth 7980.
Thank you guys for the lively chat.
Thank you indeed. We're not done yet. We want to open the floor for questions. I'm sure you have some, and it's a great opportunity to exploit the wisdom and insight of these speakers. Beforehand, I'll pose a question of my own, which I'll let you think about while other questions are asked. I think it's interesting to know what is the biggest misconception of your clients in regulation. Think about it for a while. We'd love to hear like what brokers or service providers get wrong in your day-to-day operations with them. While you are digesting, are there any questions from the crowd about your operations, about what the future holds, GDPR, MiFID? We have a hall of experts. Okay, not quite yet.
No,
Yes.
we were either too clear or too boring, which was it too.
Yeah, you've actually answered all the questions I had when I came in the room. But I'd like to pose a question stroke comment as an individual. I'm in the business, obviously. I provide material to various people. Think of me as a retail trader, a guy sitting at home. 6 years ago, I was getting phone calls from brokers, and they were talking this, talking that, 100% guarantees. We all know this. The industry has done very well to bring that down. I can tell you hand on heart, from February until now, I can draw a graph like this of the frequency of, and there's a technical term, scumbags, phoning my home phone, and they're not regulated in Mauritius, they're not regulated in Australia. They don't have any regulation. And people in my office say, why are you entertaining these guys? For me, it's, what the hell, it's curious. I'm curious. And I have the same conversation with these guys every single conversation.
These are your leads, I guess.
No, I'm the lead. That's the problem. I'm the lead. I'm on a database
He's
somewhere.
taking all the heat, yeah.
Yeah, on Friday, I had four phone calls. This is last Friday, not last year, last Friday. From these guys on their websites, they have no physical address, they have no regulation, and I have the same conversation over and over again. And without going into details, the last conversation I had was the phone slamming down on me and aggressive sexual comments about my mother. So that's how these things go. But it occurred to me that these guys are getting services from somebody. They have MT4, they have payment providers, they have marketing material. I mean, it's easy to say there's no way to report these guys. They're not SciSec, they're not FCA, they're not Australia, so who do I phone? I don't have time to phone people. But it did occur to me that somebody's given these guys service. So is there any sort of regulation that says we as individuals can't provide these unregulated guys with material?
They're GDPR regulated, probably.
Yeah, but
Having your
under
information all
what
over the place.
jurisdiction? Antarctica?
They're
I mean,
not, obviously, yeah, they're
exactly.
just manipulating leads, yeah.
Yeah. So that's the question. I mean, I know I'm digging very deep here, and this is it's a moral question, and I said to these guys, you make us all look bad. But they don't care. They don't, they really don't care. They're hoping I'm going to pick the phone up, and I'm a widower who's got a pot of money, and I'm stupid enough to give them the money. But again, I'm going to repeat the comment. They have Skrill, they have NetTeller, they have MT4. Somebody's providing these guys. I can't stop them.
You raise...
Can I take a snatch on this?
Please.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I'll try to keep my voice down. I couldn't agree more. Actually, that is one of the first things that I opened up initially when we came here, that there are people coming here which are coming with unregulated proposals, and they're just trying to, compare regulated entities with other, from my side as well, from payment side. And they're saying, provider A, payment provider A, is giving me services in Europe, and you ask them, okay, guys, so are you regulated? And, well, no, I'm not in Europe. And you do get cowboys. That's why regulation exists. That's why GDPR exists. That's why these things exist. And that's why I'm saying that I think that I would love to agree with the initial statement that regulation will go down, but these things can keep happening in Europe, so all that can happen is regulation to become more stringent.
We know where these guys came from.
I'd like to give you one nuanced example from Israeli legislation. Not that I think that Israeli legislation is wonderfully amazing, but I think it's an example, and this may lead to other jurisdictions implementing this type of legislation. But when Israel banned by law the marketing of binary options, the law included within the ban also the enablers. So you cannot be that service provider that without, and it's the major service providers, without that you don't have a platform, you're included in that ban if you fall under that category. So that's, yes.
This is a question probably from Michael. You were talking about when brokers set up in these odd jurisdictions and then they start moving their money, I guess they get hit. What did you mean? They get hit by the Japanese, they get hit by the...
By the local authorities. They get hit.
What do you mean they get hit?
They get hits. They get hits on compliance tools like WorldCheck and Reuters. So when we actually check customers coming in, you might have a reputable company out of Europe, and they're trying to now create a new market by entering Japan or Asia. So when we actually start investigating a good, reputable, according to our standards and understanding of the market, a European company to board them and give them our services, all of a sudden, because they try to enter a new market like Japan, which it's not allowed to actually go without the proper regulation, you just do your compliance and WorldCheck and Reuters and everything else that you have, Web Shield, and you start seeing that they get hits. That's what I mean, hits in compliance. They get hits in terms of finding a lot of information, a lot of manipulation in other markets, in new markets. So again, it's better to go and enter new markets with a strategy. And once again, I would emphasize, and going back also to the question that you made in what are the misconceptions. The misconceptions is that there are providers that would give you exotic jurisdictions like Japan, and you're going to go in Asia and you're going to get excellent and European standard levels of payments. Well, that's a misconception. If you go into jurisdiction where legislation is not correct or is not ready to accept you, or you don't have the right infrastructure to enter that jurisdiction like Japan, and someone tells you, I'm giving you a payment solution, be prepared to receive a solution which is going to be up to par with those standards. I mean, no matter what someone tells you, sorry for the expression, but when shit hits the fan, you're not going to get your money or you're not going to get proper representation.
I think clients confuse between regulation and enforcement. So they think that regulation is intended to combat or address criminal offenses. So a client may say, I'm not a criminal. I just want to do what I do and go home and sleep tight. So I'm okay with regulation, or I may not necessarily need regulation. And that's a mistake, because regulation is not about catching bad guys. It's about addressing market deficiencies. And once you understand that, then it's easier for you to comply with regulation. It's easier for you to anticipate regulation and to deal with it as a whole.
I think another misconception is that we provide MiFID reporting. So as a reporting company, we've had, I think, numerous times yesterday and probably this morning, people asking, do you provide GDPR reporting? So I think it's a big misconception. I wish we did, but there isn't actually a reporting mechanism with GDPR. GDPR is a set of standards specifically to two sides. One, how do you collect client information and how do you store it? And there's standards that you have to comply with that. On the other hand, where there is reports, but it's the reports you won't ever do, is how do you report publicly if you have a data breach? And you have to do that within 72 hours. So I think GDPR has a huge set of misconceptions, and it's not as crazy as people think it is.
Well, there's some misconception there. So we're required to report within 24 hours to the central bank.
Australia?
No, here in Cyprus. And we have a prescribed format. So the GDPR does vary by industry sector. Certain regulators will impose their own requirements on their licensees, and certainly the central bank has issued guidance, as I believe CySec has or is about to as well. So check with your local regulator in terms of what your obligations are.
But the reporting is specifically on breaches.
It's on breaches. I think they also want some statistics and other stuff to follow. So it's got, like all European regulation, is going to become more and more intrusive if it wasn't intrusive enough.
Natalia, concluding comment?
Yeah, it's all about the same. I think you were trying to pass across the same point. There's so many regulations that affect the brokers. I mean, ESMA, MiFID II, GDPR, everyone is properly confused because there are some conflict in pieces in all of them. Like, oh, you have to keep the customer data for 5 years. Oh, you can actually delete the customer data, right? So which one is right, which one is wrong? So I think a lot of clients are confused, and in the regulation, it is written very ambiguously. So there's a lot of work to be done for consultants.
Okay, that's good news for you guys. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for this enlightening session. Put your hands together for the speakers who have educated us about the upcoming travails of regulation or opportunities, depends how you look at it.